Bem, bom dia a todas, a todos. Good morning, everybody. Welcome, Anja. Welcome our colleagues, commenters, and also people who are following us online. Two brief words about our seminar. In the first years of this century, most of us were very optimistic about the prospect of democracy in the world. This was mostly due to the celebrated events of the third wave of democratization, as Samuel Huntington has called it, and which had its beginning with the Carnation Revolution in Portugal, followed by the Franquism in Spain and the fall of the regime of colonials in Greece. And after these initial events, the democratization wave reached also Latin America. And a decade later, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Eastern European countries. Today, however, this is seen as the past. In the last 10 or 20 years, instead of the celebration of the third wave of democratization, the concerns of observers, academic analysts, and even the citizens with the cries of democracy. Some months ago, Larry Diamond has diagnosed here at the Institute of Advanced Studies of USP about the democratic recession in the world. And other political scientists have called our attention to the reality of illiberal or hybrid regimes in reference to the recent developments of democracy in the world. I would say that this is the context of the seminar which will take place here today. Institutional performance is an important indicator for the quality of democracy. But what if institutions such as parliaments, governments, political parties, and even, as we know, specifically in the Brazilian case, courts of justice and effective bureaucracies are no longer the key to the way we hold stakeholders accountable or respect transparency and participatory forms of governance and problem solving. In this seminar, Anja Mihr will share some of the pros and cons of the current debates and aspects of multi-level, multi-stakeholder, liquid, and beyond institutionalist approach to democracy, and the consequence that this approach may have for the quality of it. This will be a very open discussion in which Anja will bring her thoughts and her elaboration for us in this new area of thinking about not only about the democratization process, but the effective reality of many democracies as the Brazilian one. Anja Mihr is founder and program director of the HUMBOLDT-VIADRINA Center on Governance through Human Rights in Berlin, Germany. She has held professorships for public policy, transitional justice, international relations, and human rights at the Willy Brandt School of Public Policy, Erfurt University, and at the Netherlands Institute of Human Rights, University of Utrecht, Netherlands. And she was visiting professor at Columbia University in New York, Peking University in China, Hebrew University in Israel, and Yerevan State University in Armenia. Anja holds a PhD in political science from the Freie University Berlin in Germany. She focused her interdisciplinary research interests on the linkage between international law and governance, democracy, justice, and human rights. So it's a great pleasure to have Anja here today, and also our colleagues, Britta from the Master's Cathedra in São Paulo, at the University of São Paulo, Adrian Lavalle, Adrian Albala, and our colleague Gabriela Carneiro, who might be arriving in a few minutes. I'm very happy to introduce this seminar, and I understand that we are going to have a very interesting discussion this morning. I will pass first to Britta to say some words also, because this is an event that is held not only by the group on the quality of democracy of the Institute of Advanced Studies, but also by the Master's Cathedra, which Britta is the director, and has been very active in our department and our university.
Okay, thank you very much, Moises, for this introduction to the seminar and for hosting us here at the Instituto de Estudos Avançados. I just want to say a few. I have no manuscript, I'm not prepared, but it's not the first time that I talk about this, obviously. So I just want to say a couple of words about the Cátedra. Cátedra, most people already know. Cátedra Martius de Estudos Alemães e Europeus, Martius Chair for German and European Studies. It's actually a visiting professorship. And it's actually just me. So I know there are other cátedras here at Pfefferleschi which are more like centers where several people develop activities under the name Cátedra of Irish Studies, things like that. In this case, it's not like that. It's a cátedra in the sense of the German concept of the chair being one professor that holds this chair and develops activities. So I don't have any collaborators, secretaries, or organizational structures below. So it's also strange to say director, because all I direct is myself, yeah, and the activities that I organize. So that's why I always try to, well, the main idea of this cátedra is to bring German scholars or European scholars to Brazil, to organize events, seminars, lectures with these scholars, and also to speak particularly about topics of German and European studies. But it's not necessarily a condition. There could also be, I've also organized some events with a clear comparative perspective between Germany and Brazil. For instance, a seminar on German and Brazilian foreign policies in comparative perspective was about 2 years ago. And or European versus Latin American perspectives on certain topics. So, and as my own research topics includes democratization and influences on democratization processes, I've also frequently already organized seminars in this topic area. So last year, for instance, we had one seminar on democracy promotion by regional organizations, comparing Europe and Latin America, together with a scholar from Poland who was visiting us at that time. And then in the second half of last year, and this was actually also the first collaborative endeavor with the group Quality of Democracy here at Instituto de Estudos Avançados, we organized a seminar on the crisis of democracy, Europe and Latin America in comparative perspective, again, looking at cases such as Poland and Hungary in Europe, and well, different cases in Latin America, including the Brazilian case, but also including comparative perspectives within Latin America. And I think this took also place in this building, in the other room still, and Moises collaborated and his group collaborated in the preparations of the seminar. And so this idea of this workshop today is to continue a bit this cooperation and to work together on this topic of current developments of democracy in the world. And so Anja's visit was a good opportunity. I abused Anja already for several other events. She was so exhausted yesterday afternoon or evening after the seminar, because she had to go through several events already here at Pfefferleschi, the Department of Political Science, but also at the law faculty yesterday morning. So we did a number of activities, and so this is the last one in Sao Paulo. Actually, afterwards she's going to travel to Rio for another activity there at PUC. And so I'm very happy to host or to be co-hosting this event or co-organizing with Moises, and I'm looking forward to the discussions. And yeah, welcome Anja, and I'm looking forward to your presentations and to your comments. Thank you.
Thank you both, Moses and Britta, for this introduction. Very kind introduction and invitation. I must admit that out of all the events I've been through so far, which were of course all super exciting and interesting, this is the one I was most looking forward to, because I have this, for the first time, the opportunity to present my new research focus ideas with you and get some, I'm sure, very excellent and hopefully also critical comments on some of the observation I will share with you on, let's say, the state of the state of state institution or democracy. And it's not something you develop over the weekend and you say, well, maybe I should contribute to these massive debates all around the world on populism and multi-stakeholder, multi-level. No, this kind of evolved over the course of the last years, because those of you, some of you have been at the presentation of the book yesterday. It was a 400-page book on transitional justice and democracy, or political regimes, and I've been working on this for 10 years. And before, I've been working for several years on human rights regimes and human rights education. And what you see, what you will hear today is sort of a continuation of that research. So it is based on facts and observations, and I'm wondering what we can draw of it. And I'm particularly happy to have the opportunity to be here in Brazil and to be here in Sao Paulo to present this, because also when you kind of sit in Europe, yeah, with all these established institutions and consolidated democracies, etc., you often lose the view of what's really happening in the world, because we often have to remind ourselves that we are actually a minority. The European Union, if you just take the European Union cases, and they already have problems, so if you think about Poland and Hungary and, you know, Greece, etc., kind of states where some people would say they're already falling apart. But even if you take that, these are 500 million people. This is an absolute minority on the planet. And this is where we often look, when you also look at the top 10 countries, the typical suspects of whatever index of quality of democracy or consolidated, you know, you have the typical suspects like Iceland and Norway and Denmark and Sweden, and sometimes probably from a Brazilian perspective, or when I'm in, last year I was in India presenting some of this idea. Of course, it's 1.3 billion people. When they hear that Sweden or Denmark is #1 in democracy, they can just laugh. They say, wait, you know, it's easy to run a state like Denmark. Come on, you know, if you have 5 million people or you have 1.3 billion people with I don't know how many different religions and languages, etc., etc., you know, you're facing a real challenge, let alone about other countries that do not even have solid democratic mechanisms. So, you know, I'm fully aware of this position, and even I'm coming from a country which is so far the largest within the European Union with 80 million inhabitants, but still, when you go outside Europe, you know, people just laugh about you. I was just recently at, I had the opportunity to be an election observer for the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, in Russia during Putin's re-election. And it was very, very interesting, because still the people there, of course, they sense their sort of the European tradition and they consider the country democratic. But of course, from our point of view, it's full of weaknesses and shortcomings. But nevertheless, that is even in this larger context, and this Russia certainly is a very, very big country, much bigger. You had 120 million people that were eligible to vote, and so you have, of course, a lot more citizens, almost 200 million. And this is a different size we're talking about, to run it, to organize it. And all this sort of inspires a little bit what I present today. So legitimacy beyond states and institutions, you probably have heard about it, you know, this what we say governance beyond nation state, and is the nation state still important? And wherever I go, and I'm sure those of you who work in the field, who go abroad at conferences, among sort of the academics, there's almost no doubt that the time of the nation state is over. There will be some sort of alternative governance model, but the nation state as such, which is only about 200 years old, I mean, it was an answer. We should, we should remind ourselves, it was in the beginning of the 19th century, an answer to other experiments of governance, usually authoritarian, autocratic, totalitarian kingships, leaderships, an answer to the shortcomings that we had, I say 500, 600, 700 years before. And so this experiment comes in a way to an end. We have sort of kind of maneuvered it. We had sometimes improved it, and particularly we Europeans, we know what nation state can do to nationalism and to even lead to wars. So I think in this sort of smaller community, there's almost no doubt that this concept, which was developed in the 19th century, including the rule of law state, and this is what's so challenging, it's coming to an end, and it will transform into something else. And this something else is really very, very intriguing, because we have a lot of interesting developments currently. And since I said I come from the human rights background and human rights institutional background, I noticed not only in Europe but outside Europe that this whole, yesterday there was actually a question to it, this whole populist, this movement of civil societies, you were mentioning the multi-stakeholder, etc. Process, that when you look at the people, what's their motivation to organize them beyond state institutions? It's just like what we've seen now with Emmanuel Macron in France, when he left the Socialist Party to create his marché, his movement, yeah? And not party. Yes, he still uses the parliament, if you want to say, but we kind of left this already, even in the so-called consolidated democracy, the traditional state institutional or the parliamentarian democracy scheme. We still use the institutions, of course, but we are in the process of transforming. When we think from the end, without even using the word democracy, parliaments and institution, and Moses, you have briefly referred to it, this is a concept of good governance that is, came up within the United Nations, and there were some people promoting it in the early 1990s. And I also think this is not a coincidence. After the end of the Cold War, there were some people, by instinct or by assumption, they were already thinking, look, what is really the core of governance? Because as you know, since 25 years, including in this country, the concept of democracy is highly disputed, not only among academics, also about policymakers, social movements, etc. But there is no doubt or very little discontent about, let's say, the core ingredients of they call the UN curb. Actually, it was the World Bank. I did some research. Well, the World Bank will curb the term good governance for various reasons. But what is the core ingredient? Then the core ingredient, as you said, of course, is a high level of accountability. The stakeholders who take decisions, they have to be held accountable. They can't do it in secrecy. Transparency in terms of whatever, public budgets and decision making, etc. Particularly the younger generation in this, the young people in this room, they grew up with it. It's my students. They always, when they see this, they say, "What is your problem, Anja?" But I still remember the Cold War, even so I'm from West Germany, but I had very close relationship to East Germany, to the communist part, the dictatorial part of Germany. And for them, even people in my generation who are around 50, they say, wow, great thing, yeah, because we grew up, this was just not an issue, let alone participation, just to participate in whatever. So it's interesting that in the 1990s this came up, and there was another reason why this concept of good governance, which you could say is the basics of our modern idea of democracy. But when you look particularly at the transition countries at that time, and also at countries like China, which was clear they would not engage in democratic sort of measures such as elections, but you could fish them with this concept of good governance. Of course, even autocratic regimes, and that's a little bit what we struggle now with within the European Union, because Hungary, Poland, they say, we have all this. We have all this. Yeah, maybe it's not the kind of rule of law, governance-based parliamentarian democracy that you in Sweden like, but we have all this. So in a way, it was first to fish the countries, to kind of attract the countries that were in early transition in the 1990s, but we struggled with this concept of democracy and said, okay, if you don't want to call it democracy, leave the term. Call it mariposa, whatever. Let's not fight about the term. Let's fight about the content. We just have figured out over the last 2,500 years, since the Greeks, in a way, that if you can hold sort of responsibles, decision makers, leading figures, in a way accountable that's pretty good for social peace in society. If you, make your decisions transparent, we've also figured out that's, it usually is pretty healthy. And if you can participate, that's what we call demos. Yeah, call it participation. You don't have to call it vote, elections, people. That is pretty good. So, of course, from the democracy field, I've always heard at that time that, this is really watering down. This is like democracy for infants, it's kindergarten level, because we have to think about something more elaborate. But interesting enough, when you go now, also when I was in Russia now, the people immediately engaged with this concept. That's what they want, but they still want Putin as a Tsar, kind of having this hybrid thing, strong leader, but good governance. Everybody wants it. So this is an interesting phenomenon, and I would today argue that, you find a very reliable majority among people, and political active people around the world that can agree on this, but they cannot agree necessarily on the kind of parliamentarian democracy that most countries have on the paper. So the question that arises, of course, is: do we really need, therefore, state institutions as we know them now, just as, let's say, constitutional courts, supreme courts, parliaments, executive powers, governments, councils? We can see, if you're a hobby historian, of course, where all these emerged, the kind of structures and institutions we have today. And I'm just reminded, I went to the Biennale in Venice 2-3 years ago. It's it was the Architecture Biennale, and there were some artists. Just engage with artists. You get a great inspiration, even as a political scientist. They made an exhibit where they showed the Greek theaters. We all know how Greek theaters, you have these performances, stages, and then you have the half circles. And they say that how our modern parliaments are a copy of the Greek theater. Drama, performance, etc. And they kind of showed the public in general, and tried to show a mirror, and said, isn't it interesting that for 2,500 years, even now, today we call it parliament, but actually it replicates 100% drama theater. What does it say about our democracy? And it's I thought it was very, very inspiring. It was a huge exhibit, and I said, well, I should engage more with artists, because it also leads a little bit to the questions I'm asking here. Do we really need these institutions, these sort of mechanisms? Yes, we want the same, I just said, no discontent, but do we need the institutions? Therefore, my assumption here is that today, particularly because of the global human rights regime, I said it yesterday in another context, that a couple of years ago the United Nations was very happy to proclaim that the Universal Declaration for Human Rights is now the most translated document in the world. It's only 30 articles, so it's not really difficult to translate it. But apparently for 2,000 years it has been the Bible, and it was the most translated and most read document, and it's now bypassed for the first time in 2,000 years by the UDHR. And it was more meant as sort of a little kind of hint and joke, and not to be taken too serious. But there was a message in there. There was a say, look, we cannot go back behind this. Yes, we can disagree about certain items, and in this massive human rights agendas that we have. We have several hundreds international treaties and contracts in human rights, which try to kind of frame the norms and the standards on how to behave. But the core concept of this idea of also self-determination, of dignity, and sort of freedom to engage and to participate, this is a virus that is spread. And that was basically the message on the UN website about 3-4 years ago, saying, look, yeah, we can argue about how to deal with the virus of human rights, but the message is spread. Wherever you go, and here in Brazil, even in the last corner, people know that they have some sort of entitlements. Academics would call it natural rights, entitlements. But when I talk to these people often, then, they know exactly they have something there that nobody can take from them, not even a government. And that is... that changes our concept also of governance. It has, you know, it sort of universally kind of led to, yeah, we need sort of people who lead us maybe, but it's not like sort of I'm an unwilling and irresponsible person that cannot take his or her own decision. So the things have dramatically changed. So my argument is here that today the human rights regime is sort of a living utopia. It's not perfect, of course, and we're working on it, but it's already lived. That dissolves states' orders in a way, because as you know, some sort of our decision-making procedures are sort of final. We even have some constitutional laws, and your constitution, I suppose, and definitely in the German Grundgesetz, the basic law, is that you cannot change our first 20 articles, for instance. You know, it's irreversible, you're stuck with it. And of course, because they're all human rights based, I'm happy about it, but other constitutions, we might be not so democratic, have that too, and that can cause a problem from within, and they completely reorganize social system. That's my assumption. And one of the reasons is that we have non-state, more and more non-state actors, and I think this is probably the most intriguing part, even beyond civil society and NGOs. I know in the 1990s and around the 2000s, we were obsessed with the role of NGOs and how they can contribute to strengthening democracy. But maybe they can also erode democracy, because basically what these organizations often do is they solve problems because the state is incapable, unwilling, for whatever reason, to do this. This is particular when the charity organization kind of blossomed and mushroomed. The non-state actors here, some of you maybe have worked on it. I know in this community, whether it's an NGO or non-state actor, is highly disputed. I read articles of various kinds, but right now there seems to be a consensus that non-state actors, they mostly separate or state actors, like ISIS would be a state actor, a non-state actor, you know, sort of terror groups or people that use, or groups that use violence. But others would say, well, we should not be so strict, because basically these are actors that do not use existing state institutions to solve their problems. Whether we agree with it or not is another thing. Private one, corporate companies, of course, semi-governmental one, that's more probably an issue in Europe with political foundations or governmental foundations. And they join in this kind of multi-stakeholder, also in the multi-level approach. This is interesting. Multi-level governance is a very European concept because it works there, because of our regional system. When I was in India last year, they didn't really know what I meant. But they knew exactly what is meant by multi-stakeholder, and it's very interesting when you also go to Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, where the state actually only existed on paper. The people know immediately what multi-stakeholder is, because that's how they run their things right now. They say, "Well, we gave up on this. It's a corrupt something." And it's also interesting, there was another research, some of you might know it, because as I suppose in Brazil too, just as in most European countries, we have indicators to measure quality of democracy. One of the indicators is the number of women in parliament. Yeah, but among many indicators. I don't know, Bertelsmann has, 200 indicators, but anyway, one indicator is women in parliament, all right. So these researchers, they went off around the world, they looked at the number of women in parliament, and they found out that the number of women in parliament in most African, sub-Saharan African parliaments is extremely high, 60, 70, sometimes 80%. So according to our measurement and our view of the thing is like, wow, I mean, Gambia is #1 democracy in the world, and obviously it isn't. And they looked a little bit deeper, and they said, well, it's actually a sign of weakness, because the guys who run the show for the last 500 years, they don't even use, I mean, parliament is something for their wives to go to and have fun, you know, it's, you just put there and your cousins and your wives. But you do politics outside the parliament, and you do it the way you're used to, whatever the culture is. Yeah. So you do not engage with the democratic means, and you kind of put, you know, I don't want to be disrespectful. I'm a woman myself, but kind of you put puppets there. And so actually the criteria that we had assumed was an indicator for democratic development is a controversy. And I think, you know, without knowing all the criteria now that most indices have, I think you could go criteria by criteria and look actually whether there are regional differences, and because sometimes we looked at countries like maybe even Saudi Arabia or some countries which are really bottom line, and then all of a sudden they fulfill some very interesting criteria, and you just know with your common sense it cannot be true because the reality is different to what the indicator says. So it's this multi-stakeholder environment, which I find absolute people know what they're talking, or when I mention it, know exactly what it is, particularly in so-called weak democracies, because this is how they solve their problems. That means that all the stakeholders, whether it's corporate, an NGO, a charity organization, or an international organization, when there is a problem because of drought or because of whatever crisis, they sit together and they solve the problem. And that is why it's so much more popular in these countries than it is often in our country. Because I often hear this in Germany, they're saying, look, Anja, this multi-stakeholder, it won't work, this is funny. But when you go to India, all over the place. And they create, in a way, non-hierarchical. It's a very practical orientated sort of governance scheme, because you just like, you have a problem, you have to solve it. It's not like, oh, I'm a state attorney, that's why I'm telling you what to do. That works in our countries, but in the rule of law countries, but not in these countries. They create non-hierarchical, but in a way legitimate authorities. I was looking a little bit more into the concept of what an authority really is, and there was one definition that I find very appealing, where they say, well, an authority, whether it's an institution or a person or I don't know what, an authority is, you have authority when when people follow your decision or others follow your decision. But in order to gain it, you don't use weapons. you use arguments. You just have to be convincing. If you say, look, we built this water pipeline because it's the most effective and efficient, it makes sense, then people will follow you, and this is how you gain authority. Why am I saying that? Because, again, we often connect authority, leadership, legitimacy, they all go closely together because of a certain institutions. You just fall into being a parliamentarian or a state attorney and you think you automatically have authority, but nobody is following you. It's a little bit what I told you about the African cases. Yeah, a parliament has authority, but if you just put puppets there, what's about nobody's following it anymore. And this authority is often based on this entitlement and natural and human rights norms. This whole natural human rights issue is coming back a little bit in the debate. I find this fascinating because honestly, I thought we passed it through the 17th and 18th century. And it was right now the natural rights debate was very strong, sort of 2 centuries before we had a nation state. And the nation state kind of collected the fruits of this debate. And in a way, we are a little bit back to this. And on the standards of good governance that I was mentioning recently. I just recently also read the sort of the second largest report by the Club of Rome. As you know, they published this book in 1971 on the limits of growth, and they have now launched a new book. It's like, I think the English translation is like, we can do it, or we have to do it. And they put a new assessment of the world and the future, etc. And they talk about relative sovereign principles. Well, it's interesting because most people that write and contribute to this assessment of the future of this planet, they are mostly economists and environmentalists, if you want. So very few social scientists or philosophers. But in a way, they say, well, this relative sovereignty, it's not the sovereignty of the state that solves the problems in the future. The states don't solve it anyway anymore. But we have to think about a new sort of concept of sovereignty, which is closely connected to who has the legitimacy to act. And that can change. It's also something, we vote, we elect governments for 4 or 5 years, and then we just say, oh, well, let's endure that. And this principles or this concept is completely different. It's basically, those who solve the problems govern. That's the message. The observations, and I'm wondering what you think about this, whether you share that or whether this is completely nuts. On the one side, the last 20-25 years, really this all starts after the end of the Cold War for obvious reasons, is that almost the mushrooming, not only on civil society level, which is the local level, the local concept here, I'm heading at that, but also on the international level. Whereas I'm sure some of you studied in the early 90s like I did, and I studied international relations, and I think we had a seminar on international relations, and I had to get to know and read about 4 international organizations in total, something of that sort, and kind of I knew it. And there were like, I think 5 human rights treaties I had to know, and that was it. Yeah. And today I'm not even telling my students anymore, I'm just saying this concept of international organizations, because there are hundreds, if not thousands, but there are hundreds of international regimes and organizations nowadays, because my students, they cannot imagine to memorize them all, because there are just too many. And I said, within 25 years, so much has developed. It's also for the NGOs, particularly in the human rights field. You know, you had like 3-4 typical suspects and you knew them by heart. Today we have several millions of NGOs around the planet. So this has dramatically grown the international, the global sort of governance regime, or the regional. You were just mentioning you have seminars on this, but of a regional, I mean international, I mean also regional, you know, everything that's of course between states, and then on the local level. So we have this really dramatic rise. And as recently a European parliamentarian told me, he said it's not only with this, in terms of human rights and international organizations, also coming to when it comes to cyberspace. He said we just can't keep up with our instruments of the European Parliament. It's one of the most modern ones in the world. We cannot keep up with the pace of development. Our decisions are always a little bit late. We are always afterwards. We are always doing damage control. We cannot be progressive with our parliamentarian institutions. It's a Dutch parliamentarian, a very progressive lady. So then this globalization beyond the trade, because I don't want to go in the traditional globalization thing, of course it comes out of trade, but we have 2 other phenomena here. This is the climate change, and there's cybersecurity or internet security, the cyberspace, where we both, some of you who have been there yesterday, they've heard the talk. I concentrated there on cybersecurity, cyberspace. But these are the 2 regimes the last 10-15 years which are the fastest growing regimes on the planet, particularly the internet governance regime or internet security cyberspace regime, which was only created about in 2005, 2006. The climate change regime is a little bit older, but why am I saying this? We have 2 regimes here, 2 phenomenons that desire global universal solutions, not local. I always, we always joke in this context when we talk about this, and then we say, well, if Sweden tries to solve the problem of climate change, nice, try to do it. If Germany tries to solve the problem of internet security, or Brazil, nice try. I think it's a waste of time. But you can try it if you insist on it. And there are some states who think they can control this. But I mean, if you're a realist and if you're not an American president who lives beyond reality, you believe that these things happen and you have to solve them on a global level. But the mechanisms we have are insufficient, and we see this because we have already some sort of pilot trials in terms of climate change and who takes responsibility, or internet security, even on the European level. And then every time we have a decision by the European Court on these issues, or by the International Court of Justice, or the UN Court, or the Court of the Sea, we have international courts, they always have to give it back to the nation states, because this is how the way the world is set up, and they often struggle to implement these decisions. What I'm trying to say is the nation state is insufficient in dealing with that. It's not our minds. I think we are there already, but it's the institutions that we have. These institutions just have limited capacity. They maybe were good in 1880 or in 1950, but not in 2018. Then we have these other phenomenon of mass migration and urbanization. There's another interesting, I'm not talking now about how many millions of migrants and where I think we have 1 in 7 citizens has a migration background. That's the latest statistic. So we are, I don't know how many people here. And so 1 in 7 has not maybe a direct, but the parents. So this is the reality of the world. There is another interesting phenomenon that comes with it, also in terms of urbanization. The megacities here on this continent, you have experience with megacities. We don't in Europe. I mean, megacities start with 10 million, 12 million above. This city would qualify already as a megacity. Is is not infrastructure so much, that is also a problem, but it's statelessness, it's a citizen status. We see that in many of these mega cities, which usually they're either here in the Americas, like also Mexico City would qualify as what also India and Mumbai, but we also have them particularly in China. So 16, 20, even there's a city with 30 million inhabitants. The problem is they don't have full citizenship right. And when you go to the Middle East, every NGO, every international organization representative will tell you our biggest problem is statelessness. People just throw away their passports or are taken away because they have more, they suffer more with having a certain citizenship because they're maybe from an authoritarian country or from Iran. And so they throw it away and they just migrate and they move there and they don't have rights. They cannot vote, they cannot participate, all the good governance principles, zero for them. And these numbers, we don't have exact numbers on the stateless because they don't register, but we have an estimate, but every UN and even European Union office in the Middle East, because I just came from there and I was working there, will tell you this is our biggest problem. Biggest problem is statelessness, because if you have people, millions and millions of people, or even 10% of a population that has no identity cards, they are not registered, how can they participate in the decision-making process? They're always, apart from that they are second-class citizens, that their children cannot go to school, I could go on. I mean, all these social problems that are obvious, but it's also in terms of governance, it's a disaster. And he says, well, that's probably the largest, fastest growing state that we have, the stateless, on the planet. In Europe, we hear very little about it, but the rest of the world, and that's why I started my introduction, we are a minority in Europe. We are the minority on the planet. That is the majority. And that's also why this idea of governing beyond nation states or institutions might be interesting. Then we have another thing, and I just, because it's one of my favorite topics, this whole cyber governance, I just want to share it with you. I'm wondering what you think about it. As I say, this whole accountability issue is very important, whether you're stateless or not, or whether you're just a citizen. You want to have hold people accountable, and we often have our limits because of our corrupt justice system. Again, this is the majority of the world. I live in a country where that is not so much the case, luckily, but I know the reality is different. And the University of Montreal, a couple of years ago, they started to develop a virtual justice, like virtual courts, that basically wherever you, a court, it's international human rights law is the benchmark. I forgot maybe to say this. This is sort of the above everything, because that's what they assume shares, the basics everybody shares. So what they were aiming at, because I don't know if there are lawyers in the room here, but if you have some law background, you know that no normal court in this world would allow testifying, you as a witness without being in the courtroom. For children, sometimes there is an exception, but they will be interviewed. They will be asked in separate rooms for protection. But every adult, if you are 18 years old and you want to witness and testify in a courtroom, you have to appear. And this has been a huge issue, particularly in conflict-torn societies where people didn't go and never arrived at courts because they were killed or they didn't dare to go. So this is a huge problem around the world, because often you don't get justice, and it's very important for social peace to get justice, because the courts are not effective, or you don't dare to go there because when you go home after testifying, your family may not be alive anymore, or they disappear. So that's the reality. So this university, with lawyers, these were lawyers, and they were trying to develop, sort of, it's like a Skype court, just to have some sort of visuals where you have judges, from around the world who are specialists, and then you can testify. And how to secure that you testify, via video, because as you can imagine, when you sit somewhere and you testify into the camera, yes, you that on the other side, you might think this is an honest witness, but maybe someone is pointing to me with a gun while I'm testifying. The judge doesn't know, and he has to know whether this is a free testimonial. So it's interesting that these are $1 million projects that are developed. So, and whoever donates this, usually it's research foundations or governments, it's a serious matter. It's not some sort of crazy idea of some sort of judge who says, I like to do Skype Skype courts. It's because there is a demand. Because I said, well, the nation state, here again, that's why I use it, is incapable to deliver justice for various reasons. Corruption, security, you name it. It doesn't matter now. We stop talking about the causes. People want justice, they want now it, and they don't get it. And we're talking about not only millions, probably billions of people on this planet. So a significant number. This is the cyber governance. So the state institutions, I'm not saying they vanish tomorrow, and I'm not talking about anarchy. I hope there is no misunderstanding. I'm just saying, what's the other form? So we have this phenomenon of a rising human rights awareness of these entitlements in a way. And I could go into my favorite topic of human rights education, but I spare it. Or if you have a question, I'm happy to give more data on that. Then this whole multi-stakeholder, multi-level approach here, I think it's more multi-stakeholder. And then there's one more concept, which is my favorite one. Some of you have heard it already. This is the idea of shared responsibility. A little bit similar to what the University of Montreal in Canada did with this kind of virtual courts idea. Is the European Union sponsored a couple of years ago in 2012, they started a global research project on what they call shared responsibility. There is a video to it. If we would have time later on, I can show it. It's only 2 minutes. What they mean by it, and it's at the University of Amsterdam. It's based, but all these international research projects, I think of course the researchers, mainly lawyers, they come from around the world. And when they looked at it, is fascinating, because they look in the future, they say, well, traditionally when you violated human rights or when you violate some sort of contract, the state takes responsibility. And even as a company, when you invest, we had the example of a German company investing here in Brazil, and in this company, on the branch here in Brazil, there were certain human rights violated. The Volkswagen at that time said, the Volkswagen company in Germany said, this is a responsibility of the Brazilian state, because we have a contract with the state. If they treat their labor unionists the way they do it, it's not our problem, inside our factory, we treated them nicely. We're out of the responsibility. You can't hold us accountable. And these labor unionists, it was the case for Brazil, it was also the case in other countries, we are not entitled to give them any pensions or compensations. Forget it. That's international law. Dot. Finito. Yeah, that was until recently. Then we had pilot project sort of cases, because there are some lawyers in the world who really try to challenge the state right now, and this is a result of it. And Volkswagen is one example, and I give it because it's a German company, but I could also play this through for Shell company, which is a Dutch-British company, and they have experience now with shared responsibility, because they mostly, they don't dig oil in the Netherlands, even though they have a headquarter in Rotterdam, but mostly in other countries. So it's a big issue for them, because until yesterday, companies could say, if it's a responsibility of the state we're investing in and not ours or in that state. And they have turned it around. They said, all right, but if you invest, you have a shared responsibility on the crimes that might happen within your company compound. You maybe have not the 50 or 60%, you don't have the 100%, but maybe you have 20% responsibility. And maybe those who buy Volkswagens, apparently it's a good car. I don't have a Volkswagen, I admit, as a German. They have another shared risk, maybe 1%, etc. So when we define, and that was the idea of it, let's say there are people suffering from, even working with that company, collaborating, or as Shell, when they were looking for oil in Nigeria, they destroyed a whole environment, villages, people had to emigrate, and there is a certain amount of compensation that these people are entitled to. Let's say $1 million or $500,000, that can be set. And then this shared responsibility project looks at, so the state should compensate, let's say, 50% of that, and Shell maybe 30%, and others maybe 1%, etc. And then the amount comes together. I hope that exemplifies a little bit what the concept is. And the European Union funded this project because they said, look, how can we better sort of give criteria for measurement and also for accountability? Which courts are responsible, who should do it? And they had sort of pilots here, particularly for international corporations that in the Shell case, they were condemned in a Dutch court, even so the let's say, the crimes did not happen in the Netherlands. And that's why I'm asking if there are any lawyers, I mean, in the room, because for lawyers, this is a no-go. You cannot be held accountable in a country that you haven't done anything, you know, not for nobody in the Netherlands, but in Nigeria, and how to hold someone with a headquarter there accountable. We see this right now with Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg. It's the same story, and the European courts are already ready to go for it. And I think that's why he will appear at every time Brussels will call him, because he knows the seriousness. 10, 15 years ago, I'm sure he would have ignored every call, because there was no way. And now the courts are exploring opportunities. Just to say that the state institutions, in this case it would be favor of state institution, but this is like, there's also responsibility for individuals, for companies. So why do we need the government if the government only pays 50% of the compensation and not 100? Just food for thought. That is it. So do we need the nation states and state institutions to govern well? Or maybe we just leave it to citizens. We just need it to movements, to groups. And some international organizations who have a sort of a different type of authority. There is not a big president. All the international organizations share one thing in common. They have secretary generals. These are not directors. They can have no decision-making powers. As you know, secretary generals can only moderate. And there's no international organization like even the Organization of American States or the Council of Europe or the United Nations that has a director. They don't have a CEO. The CEO are the members. And if you go for the multi-stakeholder approach, these members can be NGOs, individuals, experts, companies, and state representatives. So it's a completely different framework of governance. And I hope I have put enough provocation here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anja. I think this is a very fresh thoughts about our situation. And there is a very good question about what we're going to do with the nation states and with the institutions. They are still there. We know that there are, the nation state is still here, and in many different dimensions. So, in a sense, your provocation is, what are we going to do with this? Well, I'm very happy to introduce Gabriela Piquet Carneiro. Come here, Gabriela. She's one of the 3 commenters of this morning. I'm going to ask her to start with her. I'm very, very conservative in this term, so women first. No, Gabriela, here. You do? Well, in this case, I'm going to invite Adrian Albala. Adrian was a researcher of the Center for Public Policy Research at the USP, but now he's at the University of Brasilia. He's a very high qualified colleague of us, and also because he's from outside, he starts the comments. Please.
Thank you, Moises. Thank you, Anja. Actually, your discussion was very provocative actually, but also when I heard you, many things came up into my mind, especially regarding the evolution of political science. Because when you look forward, you look back to how political science has developed in the last 60 years, the mainstream discussion, the most part of discussion in the literature, looked with the good government, especially which is the best form of government when you go back, even before the institutionalization of political science, whether presidentialism, whether parliamentarism, then which kind of institutions. And now you present that actually it's not the good government, but it's the good governance, which actually also goes with the evolution of political science in the last 10 or 15 years with the entrance of economics and also political administration. So it's very actual your position. But in some parts, if I can I can say also, if I can perhaps be also as provocative as you, we can say that your presentation, even if you state that today every countries or every regimes try to present themselves as democratic or try to improve their democracy feelings, we can perhaps think in a kind of revenge of Fukuyama somehow, as democracy has become the soil from to the sky as a point of departure to enhance. Fukuyama used to say that about the institutional democracy and also the institutional form of democracy, but you go forward and beyond of that. In my vision, you have very interesting points and very interesting diagnosis actually, when you point out that institutions are not that important as to constraint or to proceed to democratic positions. But perhaps you discuss, especially with the discussion that state cannot do everything, and states are not present everywhere, or state institutions. And this reminds me a discussion that arose in the last 20 years, last 15 years, with the difference between statelessness, as you talk about, but also state capacity versus state size. See what I mean? The discussion until 1980s, 1990s was about whether a big state or small state, a larger state or a small state. And today, perhaps, the discussion, and also the discussion that come through your positions, comes with the capacity of the state, how the state can enforce civil society or enforce other organization of the civil society, whether if the state can do everything. And this discussion is very actual, actually, when you look. The same Fukuyama has now changed his position from democratic position through the organization state capacity, but also other scholars like Hilal Soyler or other ones that say that today it's not important on how many instances the state is present, but how it can enforce, how it can ensure or constrain anti-democratic positions. And that perhaps is also a position interesting in your position, because as I see, you drop out, you point out very important ineffectiveness, inefficiency of modern states and actual states. You even talk about some perhaps the most exciting states in terms of democracy, like the European ones, but also the United States. And even in these kind of states, you have some democratic issues. Hungary today, Germany perhaps tomorrow. But in this position, the position or the answer you drop out is how outside or in parallel to the organization, say, especially through the civil society, as I understand. And this reminds me also the discussion dropped out by Pierre Rosan Vallon. In fact, it's a new version of Tocqueville's democracy. You know? You're not talking about the democracy, how democracy organizes itself, but especially how people make democracy. And it's a renewal of Tocqueville's 2.0, if you can say this point of view. And Rosan Vallon, which I know in the United States is not very, very famous, or for English people it's not very famous, but Rosan Vallon has dropped in this concept of counter-democracy, in which the civil society is the organization that could perhaps save in some ways the Tocquevillian conception of democracy. And this reminds me very clearly what's your position, especially when you talk about the shared responsibility. In my opinion, among the three positions you dropped out, this is the most exciting one, especially regarding the responsibility of the consumers, but also the proper civil society. So this is also the position and the necessity to enforce this civil society to organize itself. But the question is that what happens when there is no civil society organized? The civil society hasn't been organized or has been completely diluted. Because when you look at Latin America, or in countries where the state hasn't been organized so strongly as in national state organization like in Europe, civil society used to be cooptated by other organizations, especially in Latin America, for taking this example, the churches, or the church. And this is how the civil society used to organize itself. And today, if your positions are interesting, I was wondering perhaps if institutions also were interesting for constraining, perhaps not governing, but constraining some position or constraining some organization of the civil society, because proper civil society also has its issues and its interests in it. So, what is the limit of the different organization of the civil society, of this distinct organization of the civil society? Today, you mentioned especially on NGOs, but they are only a part of the civil society, not the great part. And also, NGOs sometimes make some problems for the proper civil society, or for the proper governments in some countries. No? And my question also, I was wondering, do you in this position or in your work, because if I resume somehow, you argue for a worldwide organization, not a worldwide organization, but a worldwide civil society in which the civil society would be present everywhere, or somehow the responsibility should be organized, should be organized or presented everywhere. My question is, should this position also not legalize, but should we consider also the right of intervention, not intervention, but some French minister used to say that when there is a problem in a country, you have the right to intervene here in order to, I don't know if you remember. Exactly. Responsibility. Do we have a shared responsibility to protect elsewhere, even outside of our country, in the name of the shared responsibility? Which is the limit of the shared responsibility? Is it nationally way, or is it worldwide shared responsibility? This was my main position. Because institutions used to constrain this way. But if there's no institution needing, which are the constraints, or which are the limits for the intervention? Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm going to call Adrian Navarre now. Adrian is a professor.
No, you before your presentation.
Você estava falando sem microfone.
Ah, sim. No, Adrian is a colleague, a professor at the Department of Political Science of the University of São Paulo. Is also a researcher at the Center for Research, Innovation, Diffusion of Metropole Studies and Research at the Center of the Brazilian Analysis and Planning, SEBRAP, and also is a coordinator of the Center of Democratic Research and Collective Action. Is editor-chief of the Revista Brasileira de Ciências Sociais, and member of the Direct Executive Association of the National Postgraduate and Research Association on Social Science. Well, there's a lot of other items that I should mention. It's a very good pleasure to have Adrian again here and to make his comment.
Well, thank you very much for this kind invitation. I thank Brita and I thank Professor José Álvaro Moisés, and obviously I thank Anja for this wonderful talk, quite provocative indeed. For the sake of discussion, I understand that actually it's provocative exactly to produce results, not because you actually hold firmly all the things you are saying. I mean, not because you think that the state is going to disappear, but it's good to put it bolded, so to put it in bold terms so we can discuss it. So if I understand correctly, we are asking do we need state after all? state institutions, at least. And when it comes to politics, it means that state institutions is what we call democracy. So after all, we need democracy at least as we know it, as we think in democracy, or we have been thinking in democracy for the last centuries. Do we need this kind of institutions, or do we have something else to put in place? Because actually there's something else in place everywhere else, not in Europe. So it seems we should look towards south, towards west, not just in Europe, because there are other kind of arrangements that actually are dealing with governance, and maybe with good governance. It can't be democracy as we know it, but actually it's somehow democratic if you think that governance or good governance aims to be a kind of democratic way of producing decisions. So, well, it's a quite provocative question. And I would say that for us, at least thinking from Brazil, as part of these new times, as part of transitions of this third wave of democratization, we actually moved forward in the path of democratic innovation. So we in Brazil, we have, I would say, a notorious experience or number of experiences in democratic innovation. And for us, right now, the questions we are asking is that if these kinds of innovations would stand for long, because everything is changing now. So we actually went through the path of opening councils and conferences and lots of different things for making a more kind of democratic way of governing government, or a more good governance way of producing decisions. But we're not sure we'll keep these institutions for long, depending on how national politics evolve. So this is the kind of, I'm just a note, a contextual note, in the sense that what we are thinking now in Brazil in terms of democratic innovation is what is going to happen now. Because it seems that everything is changing so fast that we are not sure that we're going to keep in place what we achieved as a result of democratization. So that's the kind of questions we are thinking here, which actually are at lower scale of abstraction and a lower scale of would say, of theoretical implications than the kind of questions you are posing to us here. So let me go directly to your question. Legitimacy beyond state institutions. So if we can choose between keeping state institutions, political state institutions, or embracing other kind of good institutions, which are not the ones we know, it seems that we have another kind of ways of producing legitimacy. And obviously this kind of diagnosis was produced firstly, I would say, in the European Union, because the whole idea of hollowing out the state, because the new arrangements were actually hollowing out the state from below and from above. And I would say that maybe it's a kind of very European diagnosis, which is somehow weird with your own presentations, because you are saying, look, let's look out of Europe. But the very idea of hollowing out the state, as it was posed, it was a very kind of European understanding of the process of building European Union. So there's kind of tension there. In that case, I would say it depends too much on the time frame. So in a cosmological time frame, obviously there won't be state and there won't be earth and there won't be us. So it depends if you are thinking in 100, 200, 300, 400 years. National states are kind of new. If you take a broad time frame, 300, 400 years at most. But I don't think that it seems that they're going to be out of history in the next few centuries. So it depends on, I mean, not as they would be wiped out. so it depends on the time frame. So that's one of the things I would like to hear you. So in what time frame are you thinking? Because actually, if we think in Europe, in Europe, there is something very interesting going on, but there's a good deal of variation if we look across the world. And if you look at bigger states like USA or like India or like Brazil or like Russia, they don't think to be very interested in opening states. Actually, we are kind of seeing something in the opposite direction. So it depends on which states are you looking at, and then at what time scale are you thinking of. Although I do agree that actually national states are not working now as they used to work. They won't work in the foreseeable future as they have been working. But I don't think that that's the same as saying they won't be here. No, so they are changing, but changing is not the same as they are perishing. No, they are, at least not, I would say, not in what I can see as a feasible future in a small time scale frame, let's say 1 century or something like that, but I would like to hear about it. So another way of reframing your question is, in terms of democracy, is, so do we need democracy, which is, do we need political institutions as we know them, because we actually can have good governance, which are not exactly the same as democratic institutions. You can produce good governance through other means. So your examples are examples of kinds of good governance outside of democratic institutions. So can we live without democracy, with other kinds of arrangements? And you offer us a kind of, I would say, normative standard for saying that that's possible. So the normative standards would be fundamental rights, human rights. Because if we think in democracy, the standard is constitution, and the way constitutions define basic rights. But we can have another kind of non-national normative standards which are fundamental rights. So if we have a regime of fundamental rights, we can stick to some normative parameters, and then we can have good governance thinking in normative parameters, which is fundamental. I still, so that's the whole discussion about cosmopolitan solutions to problems, to global problems. Are we still dealing with national states, or we need to go to cosmopolitan solutions, which are mandatory for everyone and in another scale? I would say that I'm not so sure that actually we can grant fundamental rights out of constitutional national frameworks. So I'm not saying that they can be reduced to constitutional national frameworks, because actually they are broader than that. They are bigger than that. They are more abstract than that. They are universal, while national states are not. Still, the way in which these kind of rights were actually granted were through national constitutions and through a level of international set of institutions. So I would say that those might not be opposite things. We need both in that sense. We need national states and national constitutions, because that's a way of keeping, for some countries at least, for a good part of the countries, to keep fundamental rights in place. Then here, my question would be as well, obviously there are other arrangements, but maybe it would be nice to hear a bit about what is exactly your claims about these other arrangements, because you are saying to us, well, it seems that we're having telling the history of all humanity looking from Europe, but that's a very thin space in the world. And actually, when I was hearing you, I remember my days at primary school, that we had a subject called Universal History, which is a pompous, a kind of pretentious name, no? Universal History. And universal history was the history of Europe. So that's what we learned. So there was two kinds of histories, national history that was Mexican and universal history that was Europe. So that's the world. In one sense, what you are telling to us, I'm feeling, is that, well, we need to correct our self-perception of what is actually the political history of the world, but it seems we are projecting images from a very small part of the world. But if that's a claim, then it might be there might be not something very new about it. Because part of these things you are saying is we have something new, but actually if your main claim is we need to correct, then there's not new, because there was never national states that we know it in the most part of the world, and no democracies in most part of the world, so correcting the focus is one thing, and looking at new trends is another thing, and correcting the focus actually is not a new trend. It's like saying, well, these kinds of arrangements have been there for centuries, and they have worked somehow. I mean, they are still there. So we can learn something from these kind of arrangements. I would add just something about one of your examples of good arrangements, and I would like to hear you about it, which is the example of multi-stakeholders legitimacy, like the one we found in India, which the big guys that actually can deal with problems are the ones that are seated taking decisions. That's common in many Indian cities. Companies, corporations are actually dealing with public goods, and they are providing public goods. Here, I feel somehow uncomfortable because of the following reason. Governance, it's both an empirical and it can be both. It's an empirical and normative concept. As an empirical concept, when we think in governance, is who governs. It's who governs, which means who has the power to define collective goals, who has the power to produce some coordinations among principal actors that actually are important or matter for pursuing these collective goals, and who have the power to enforce that. So when we think in governance, we're saying, well, actually, the news is that government is not the only player in town that actually does these things. Other players in town does these things, and in some cases, like India, actually, government does not play a significant role doing these kind of things. But then the question is, the guys that are seated there, I seated there because they are powerful, not because they should be seated there from a normative perspective. So when you take a look on that as an arrangement, we say, well, yes, but they are there because national state in India was somehow weak. State levels are stronger than national level. National level can't impose obedience in state level governments. And so you had a kind of political history that actually would say make the state capabilities kind of low. So what you are finding in place are strong powers actually taking the decisions. They might have some normative commitments among them, but actually I'm not sure that can be, how can we think that in terms of democratic criteria? Should they be there doing that in terms of a good governance normative approach? So that's something that I would like to hear about. Actually, just one note. I think it's kind of an ecological perspective. When you have very strong players, it means that we have all the players that are weaker. So what we have found is the okay.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you, Adrian. Thank you very much. Well, I'm going to call now Gabriela. Well, Gabriela is also a researcher of the Center for Public Policy Research at the University of São Paulo. She has done a very provocative book and work on new populism recently. She specialized on quantitative methodology by the European Consortium for Political Research. Has been some time at the International University Consortium for Political and Social Research at the University of Michigan, and has been doing a lot of work on political parties, representation, civil society. So it's very, I'm very happy to have you here today. Gabriela.
First of all, it's okay here? Yeah. Good morning to everyone. Sorry for my second floor English. I'm not professor yet, so I am a little bit, yeah, a little bit. Like 4 floors. I'm a researcher, and sometimes I think I pass my time beside the computer, not talking. So, first of all, I'd like to thank you, José Álvaro Moisés, for invitation at this important meeting to discuss about some models, maybe, of democracy and institution in a moment in this country in which our society and next generation of political representatives have a challenge, okay? And a chance to improve even more, our democratic institutions. Even though some groups in civil society have polarized the political discourse about impeachment, about way policies should be taken, and about courts, I think democratic institutions here seems to work like the only game in town. It means formal democracy is working, it's okay, and this is a good news. In a country where democracy is just 30 years old, so if you have 30 years, it's 30, congratulations, because you grew up in a free country, okay, where all people can vote, it's okay, or justify her or his absent, discuss politics, of course, if they want, promote free speech, and participate in legal mobilization and social movements also. But, like Powell, Dalton, and Strong said, democratization is also an ongoing process. Even when states adopt democratic institutions, there is no guarantee that they will grant human rights and civil liberties to all the people, okay? Democracies have to balance, in my point of view, between respecting the will of the citizens' majority and protecting the rights of citizens' minority. So, from the perspective of quality of democracy, despite some conceptual controversies, it seems no longer sufficient to analyze the regime only from the formal and institutional point of view. That is, institutional engineering. I think it's a great, there is a consensus about it. If there is only consensus forming among scholars who adopt the equality approach in their analysis, it refers to necessity to analyze even the promise by the regime institutions, relate to final outcomes expected by democratic process, including, in this case, fundamentally, civil liberties and civil rights. In this perspective, the more accountable, in my point of view, trying to link with the quality of democracy, the more accountable the the democratic institutions, both horizontal and vertical, the more effective the outcomes of public and social policies. Correct? Treating the performance of democratic governance. So, I'll be my point, okay? Some few words about good governance. You told here, I saw at the beginning. According to United Nations, the concept can be summarized in 9 meaningful and measurable words, include transparency, responsibility, accountability, participation, responsiveness to the needs of the people, democratic institutions, I think we have, rule of law, and fighting corruption also. So, from these elements, it's possible to affirm that the concept of good governance is close linked, or no, I don't know, maybe I see this close linked to the concept of the quality of democracy, since its analytic constructs are practically the same. However, it's like that a more prominent element in the idea of democratic governance is the role of civic engagement and collective cooperation based on interpersonal trust in local communities. In my opinion, interpersonal trust and localism are two phenomena that can be considered latent for the debate on democracy beyond institutions, since it implies that active engagement of different sectors of society, civil society, private actors, and democratic institutions can be worked together if we have a civic engagement. Another perspective about confidence building was according to Putnam's well-known theory of social capital, good democratic governance is a consequence of interpersonal trust. That is central to the political engagement of citizens. So, to build in social capital, okay? First of all, in a society, culturally speaking, you need to civic engagement culture to produce confidence and a good state and good policies. Another perspective, his theories, as we well know and we discussed at the beginning, at the end of the last century, the beginning of this. Wow, the time is... his theories as fundamentally criticized for its cultural determined opinion, deterministic. It's cultural deterministic. Another perspective about confidence building was introduced by Judith Tendler. Judith Tendler, in the 90s, in her book, Good Governance in the Tropics. In this case, Tendler argued that the state is not a central problem, and the cause of bad policies in developed democracies, on the contrary, can be a reliable source of production where this element is not part of the past history, but can states building trust. And so Judith Tendler attributes success to health program in Brazil, states of Ceará. Yeah, you should read this book. It's very interesting. Was considered very successful program of policies, and she attributes success to incentives provided by states and local agents, localism again, and local agents and local people. Why? She considers two main factors for explanation. The governance investment in publicity, a lot of publicity, to positive publicity about the health program in that place. And the autonomy of work of agents who were on the people's place, agents of health. In this case, happened the centralization of administration here in Brazil, because we had a very centered, state-oriented. Okay. Like Adrian told before, Brazil also has an example of civic engagement, state-oriented, that was copied by other countries, including Latin America and Europe. That's no orçamento participativo, participatory bidding. Okay. Now I'm going to tell you my point. After 30 years of democracy and some very good experience in a popular decision-making participating, I think we had a not multi-level, multi-stakeholders in the process we had, after all. Even they come from a state-oriented public action, why public opinion, particularly in Brazil, are so, it's not for you, these questions, but even though we had these these examples, successful of policies in a local communities, like a result, outcomes from states. Sorry, I need to come back. Why people are so unsatisfied with political institutions? I have been thinking of this double vector of causality with political culture. So, and democratic institutions, because I think this is an important issue on your point of view about how people can act without institutions. So, in this way, I think, are we prepared for a kind of deliberative participation beyond parties, institutions, or we should make in better parts, systems, institutions, choices? Because, I don't know if we have time, in order to contribute to a comprehensive explanation of citizens' support for political parties, in a multi-level analysis, I have tried to elaborate a multi-level comparative model, including people values, because I think it's important thing talking about people value, where values comes from. It's not a little determinist. Also, this kind of thinking that, well, now we can act like old democracies where people even don't trust in political parties, don't trust in Congress, parliaments, but this, I think if the fact we don't trust in politics also has the same meaning. Understand? I think I hypothesize that maybe Europeans can be prepared, and here in Latin America and even Brazil, we need more time and experience with states, a better model of democracy. So this is my question, and I don't know if I can choose a model about some particular, maybe after, okay. It's okay, it's a little, okay, yeah, I thank you.
Thank you, Gabriela. Thank you very much for your contribution. I'm going to, would like to invite also Brita to come and say, put some questions, whether you would like to do it. As our partner in the organization to help this. Well, if yes, okay. If not, I'm just going to add a very simple, very small question, I would say. If I understand, if I read well what you were saying and your presentation, in a sense, is a very good question towards dispersion of power. You are saying to us that in many sense, the democratization process means that more actors are, in a sense, intervening in the decision-making process, and in this sense, doing it through their own experience, not necessarily through institutions. I think this is a very good point, because you're right in this. It put the question whether we do need institutions to have a good government. You're not saying to have government, but to have good government, good life, and therefore, what in a sense is very important in the political thought. My question is, legitimacy is always based in the idea that partners of the experience of the political community are the actors that decide what the laws are for all. And therefore, legitimacy is a consequence that citizens are actors of the norms, the rules, and in a sense, this is very basic. But as we all know, this is not sufficient to actually establish a good government. And the other concept that comes together with legitimacy is enforcement of the law. So my point is, in this picture of power dispersion that you have presented to us, where is the enforcement of the law? I think you could go through answers now, and then we open to the floor to have more questions. If you agree, if the floor agrees.
Thank you so much, and thanks for the comments. They're just fabulous. Because I mentioned earlier in a smaller round that next week I have a presentation at a big foundation in Germany on this topic. They invite researchers with crazy ideas, and they consider this idea crazy enough to be presented. And there I have 2 minutes and sort of 1 hour of discussion. So you prepare me very well now for what I'm going to expect there for my critics. I just pick a few points. I think they were all super valuable. Particularly, it's interesting, the first comment when you were mentioning about, maybe looking back at Fukuyama and Tocqueville, there were already some tries. I will look into them. I have the books. I haven't really. I have to look again into this. And I really, really like the idea about, it's not a coincidence, really, this idea of R2P came out in 2005, the report. So, it started end of 90s, the idea of, basically it was at that time, was it Kofi Annan at that time, the UN Secretary General, kind of said, look, you state, particularly the European states, you failed to secure security during the Kosovo conflict or the Yugoslavia war, and it was the end of the war in Kosovo '99. Kofi Annan came up, was it Kofi, saying, "Look, guys, let's think about another way of intervention and securing peace." And because institutions failed, probably. And then in 2005, the R2P report, the Responsibility to Protect report, came out. It hasn't really gotten so much into force. In Libya, they tried to apply it. Now in Syria, it completely failed. But the idea is, also from an academic point of view, at least there were, even on the international level, some thoughts and some time to spend. How can we secure, let's say, security, safety, peace beyond the nation state, because we have the UN Charter and we're stuck with it, and you are not supposed to intervene if 150,000 conditions are not met. And that is all the picture of 1945 and maybe not of 2018. So I really like that. And that is not a coincidence that a couple of years later, this research project on shared responsibility came about, because it goes in the same notion. At the end, who is going to do the job? And because people, honestly, when they want justice, when they want peace and security, they don't care who it provides, as long as it's provided. And if you tell them what they have to contribute, maybe they go for it. I mean, there is a basic idea about behind it. And about this shared responsibility, which as you can see, I'm completely fascinated by this project and this idea. And this links a little bit to your to your question, to your point, Moises, about enforcement. I think that goes... because for the traditional way of enforcement, the law, decisions, you know, usually in a functioning state, you have police, someone picks you up from home, puts you into prison because there has been a decision or whatever. I mean, that's the kind of enforcement we know, and or tax authorities, et cetera, but maybe this shared responsibility tries to, I'm not saying replacing, but add to the idea of how could an enforcement look like in this kind of multi-stakeholder, local governance, governance model. And because, yes, of course you need someone when you have this shared responsibility idea and you say, look, Shell is responsible, or there has been the violation, the forced immigration of a whole village in the Ogoni Delta in Nigeria. These people lost homes. It's worth, the whole thing is worth $5 million. That's more or less the compensation. And then you share the responsibility. Okay, let's imagine we have a formula for that. And then everybody gets a bill. You and I, we get a bill because we have 0.1% responsibility for these these evictions, and then Shell maybe has 50, and the state of Nigeria has 20. So, but who enforces that? Yeah, and yes, we need. And now I would continue with my provocation. Immediately we would say state institutions have to. Yeah, maybe it's local institution. Yes, it's like a global warrant. We have this case now in Europe with Puigdemont. A great thing, the Catalans, and it's a German local court actually who tells the Spanish government what to do. It's quite unique actually. However, and in this case, it would be local. Yes, it would be local authorities. Maybe we call them police in the future. I don't know what we will call enforcement groups, maybe, who say, all right, there was a decision by whatever virtual court. I'm very much in the future now, I know. This virtual court who says there is such and such responsibility. And by the way, Anja, you are sharing 0.1%. That makes $20.50 for the evictions at the Ogoni Delta in Nigeria. There is there's an account in, I don't know, Brussels or Montreal, and we go there, we make sure you pay the $20. And it sums up, if we have all the shared responsibility people together, up to $5 million after a year, and then we pay the compensation. I mean, I would say that we cannot go beyond, we have to enforce decisions, but it may be not the national institution, because also the idea of corruption comes in there, What are these, maybe it's becoming more local. I'm a very big fan. Legitimacy and power. Yes, I just noticed I kind of skipped this legitimacy definition. I've talked about authority, because authority and legitimacy, you say you have legitimacy when you have authority, and I elaborated a little bit how to get authority. And you were saying that it's a bit the consequence of an action, of course, that you do, and you're only legitimate. I can say I'm a legitimate actor, but if you don't trust me, if you don't believe me, if I don't have a best solution for you, I can say so much about my legitimacy. I'm not legitimate, because I make no positive difference for you. Yeah, so finish. But I like both of you. You said, well, isn't it about power sharing? And as you notice, I think I didn't use the word power once in this presentation. And this is very, very, it's very connected to the state institution, our formal concept. I grew up with power sharing and sharing sovereignty, European focus. I have the European chip, multi-level. I know what it is. Sharing power, sovereignty, and to what extent. I can go on for hours on that. And I'm trying to free myself. I'm really trying to free myself from this European super chip. Now I'm wondering whether it's because power has this connotation at the end, even if you're not convinced, here comes Habermas through. I mean, I'm a bit critical of Habermas, but I must say I'm very infiltrated, because actually what he basically says is, if your argument is just good enough, the people will follow. You just have to shape your argument. It's your fault if they don't follow. And the older I get, the more skeptical I am of that. But nevertheless, there comes a little bit of this deliberative that you say in there, to say, you know, power for me has almost a negative connotation, because you enforce something even against the will, or maybe even the best solutions. So I try to avoid the term power, and I say maybe legitimate actions. That is what I would take. There were 2 points I just wanted to refer to it, because you raised it, Adrian, and I reformulated. What is actually why do we have democratic institutions in the first place? And it was an answer to something in the past, and it's an answer to today, because when we go to failed states, to Somalia, you know, we would say, why don't you try it with democracy? You know, it has some sort of advantages. But it was a model. It was I say experiment to bad governance, failed governance, finding solution of the previous regimes. And what you were saying is, maybe we are always and continuously in this stage. You all say this, to correct these institutions, but not necessarily to abolish them. Maybe, yeah, in a European context, share sovereignty, make it more local, make it more local. This idea, yes, multi-level, but not necessarily building new institutions. But it was still these institutions are the elephants in the room, and I'm wondering whether we need institutions as such. Whether they cannot be. I didn't talk about this here. This what they call liquid democracy or liquid governance. To say, and I learned this a little bit from my students, from this Facebook generation. They say, we organize today, so civil society movements, etc. They always think NGOs are yesterday. They are so old-fashioned. Who wants to commit to an organization for the rest of his life? We solve the problem. We organize. It's an organizational structures. We organize now, with various stakeholders to solve the problem of local pipelines, water pipelines. And we organize now to tackle an issue of climate change and the consequence of climate change. We organize. Yes, this organizational structure can work for 2 weeks, 2 months, or even 2 years, but it's not an institution. And the mandate, in a way, if you want to say, is the do no harm rule, the universal standards. I know it sounds very idealistic, but we have seen little pilot projects. And last year I had an event with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Germany, a huge event. It was about also cyber and media in sub-Saharan Africa. And we had a lot of African colleagues. Luckily, they had funding, and we could invite a lot of African colleagues. Mostly, they were social movements activists, let's say. And they were telling us how they intervene in democratic campaigns or local campaigns through I don't know, WhatsApp and Facebook groups and all sorts of social media. I had never heard of things they were telling us, because they also say, well, we are constantly running with institutions, with police. We set up something, we know tomorrow it will close down. So we have also exit strategies, how to reorganize us 2 days later, all on social media. And it was absolutely fascinating. In what kind of world these live? It sounded for me like a parallel world of activists in sub-Saharan Africa, which deal with only corrupt institutions, where parliaments are full of puppets, and still they want to organize, they want to govern, they want to solve problems. They're political activists, and it's fascinating. And of course, when they hear about our institutions and that I go to court if I have an issue with my neighbor, they think this is the most ridiculous thing in the world. Yeah, they don't have these options. So. I'm not sure about correcting institutions. These people work very hard. Maybe they gave up on correcting because they say, we just pass the institutions. Again, I'm not sure what it comes out of there, but I'm not so sure if it's really correcting or improving institutions. There are some countries, I think, who have improved it to the best extent ever, which are the typical suspects of countries, but it doesn't really work around the world. I'm skeptical. Yes, I leave it there. I like this, of course, the continuation, institutional engineering I liked, because there is a concept behind it. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'll take it and I will reshape my arguments for next week. I know that, for my presentation in Germany.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, okay, we are going to open to questions from the floor to all colleagues, students, and wants to make questions to Anja. Please, it's opened. Yes? If
I'm going to say, don't worry. My name is Antonio Cavalcante. I am a master's student at the Political Science Department. And first of all, thank you for your presentation, not only today, but also yesterday, a rather engaging talk. And actually, I'm afraid I may have a lot of questions, way too many. You know, I'm going to ask some questions and also make some comments. But first of all, for instance, in your opinion, what will be the underlying cause if you're dealing with democracy, democratization at a faster pace, for instance, in innovative structures and institutions? What will be the underlying cause, for instance, of the enforcement of autocratic regimes in some regions? In a way, if you can trace a historical parallel, we had some examples of something more or less similar, of course, in other terms, for instance, in the 30s, when we had an expansion of the liberal option, for instance, and democracies contrasting with autocratic alternatives. We, in a way, had some sort of this contrast before. Of course, we are seeing in a much more complex situation today. But in your opinion, what gives if we have in one of the sides this innovation, and on the other side the enforcement of autocratic regimes? What will be the cause of this disparity, for instance? Is it related to some sort of underlying political culture, as you mentioned yesterday, for instance? Or it could be perhaps some sort of a last instance of force of those regimes to demonstrate that they can still deploy a strategy of governance, for instance. And I actually think that, I mean, we are dealing here with the concept of a nation state, which for a long time has been the canonical, the historical, political agent which operates at international level. I think one of the main difficulties we have when we deal with some sort of reinvention of this agent is that there is a long time, there is a long pace of adjustment of the international institutions. For instance, we take the UN framework in terms of agents who have actual deliberative power and can imprint decisions. The Security Council, for instance, they operate by sovereign states. So I guess the key element is not only analyzing the degree by which institutions are necessary, but what is our concept of sovereignty nowadays, for instance, and how that relates to the international world as a whole, for instance. And instead of dealing only with the, I mean, how can these communities can externalize themselves? Which raises my second point, for instance. You have been analyzing the state, but how do you see the potential future, or if there is such an understanding of the nation, for instance, the concept of nation? Because in many ways, I see that the articulation of nation-state has been the strategy, the unitary strategy to create a sort of reciprocity and articulate a sense of legitimacy by which power can be exercised. The main instances of the state, if we are to reduce it to a minimum level, would be the use of violence, legitimate use of violence, for instance, coercive power, the sense of currency, and the capability of printing a local currency or money, for instance. Many of these have been eroded, for instance. But do you see this mobilization of civil society, of population, to be in a way a phenomenon which can relate to the nation? I mean, the sense of nation. Are they civil, or can they relate to the sense of community, identitary ties among these members? Because it's interesting, when we start dealing with the question of human rights today, there is a very complex debate among the universalist question of human rights based on the individual, which is a classical liberal contribution, the sense of the individual. But we also have many fragmentary groups which would tend to a more nationalist approach, for instance, which articulate a sense of rights of representation and of expression which are based on groups, for instance. So there is a very nebulous interaction between the question of human rights, the question of representation and participation, based on the individual and based on groups. And also, the problem of the state, I guess, is that it's being attacked, for instance, from outside, because of the pace of integration and regional dynamics, and also from inside, because of the demands for official representation. So it's a very complex question, and together with the sense of newly emerging autocratic regimes and enforcing ones, we are seeing new waves of nationalist movements, which in many ways relates to your talk yesterday. I find fascinating the relationship between, it's a rather interesting topic, how you would conduct, for instance, transitional justice in cases in which there has been ethnical cleansing, and how can you say, for instance, to a certain population that there is an equity of representation of all the identitary communities or cultural communities in a nation. I mean, there are cases, especially if we are dealing with plural, culturally plural countries or multicultural countries. This raises a lot of discussion. And also the key element of our time, I guess, is how do we imprint representation? I mean, and that is where institutions get in. And the information age, I mean, blockchain has been the new addition to the whole debate by which we can organize ourselves, for instance. We have a pace of reciprocity which is unprecedented. Otherwise, in previous time, we would need an institution or a certain official organ to mobilize ourselves. Nowadays, we have a much more vivid degree of spontaneity in that because of the informational age. So, well, I mean, I ended up talking way too much, but my key question would be, if you see a relationship with the nation in this kind of civil movement, if that is so, do you see that the nation is being reinvented, or is it becoming also obsolete together with the classical articulation of a nation state? And well, I actually forgot the second main point. But I mean, if you could just comment on those topics, I would be much grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. I wonder whether we have another question on the floor. Yes.
Yeah, I can collect. Hi, Anja, thank you. My name is Juliana. I'm also in the master program of the political science department. And my question appeared in the comments, but more specifically, I was wondering, how does the multi-stakeholder perspective take into account the role of what I would call the normal citizen, the majority of the citizens who do not have time or the means or even interest in participating in a movement or NGO or at the administration of a company? I mean, how this citizen, the majority of the citizens, the normal citizen or the median citizen, would participate in a multi-stakeholder perspective.
Okay, thank you. Any other question? Yes.
I am Renata. I am not a political scientist. I am just a normal citizen, and I am a USP functionary too. And I can say that I am an independent activist, and I would like to make some comments on my previous political participation. I pretty much agree with you that the concepts of transparency and participation, and I forgot the first ones, are good concepts. I defend them in the trade union. I defend them in my daily work, but the problem arises. I'm talking about my experience. See, so now we have here a hospital that belongs to university, and I worked in this hospital like 10 years ago, and every new rector, when it comes, he wants to to desvincular, they say, oh, this is social. It's not university. The aim of university is scientific, is academic. So the hospital must go to the government, to the state government. Oh, it's okay, but it's not us. And we have always fought against this. Thanks, hospital is still with us. But when you are talking to the population, to the citizen, you have to be very careful with what you say, with your words, because as Gabriela put, we have a model system, universal system of health that is copied around the world. And there, put yourself on my place. I am then with a microphone, and I am talking to the people that lives around in our neighborhood, for who the hospital is essential, and I try to dialogue with them, and again, what the question that Gabriela put, why they have such a bad image of the state hospital. And my responsibility when I am with a microphone talking to them is to say, whoops, wait, hold on. They have problems, but this is a model hospital. Our health system is model to the world. And even though I don't love the state as it is, I am in a position that I have to defend it. I have to say to the community, your problems with the hospital we discuss later. In this point, it is essential to defend this public hospital. And I could talk for hours about this, and I believe in everything you put. I broke with the trade union because the representative way to do the things, it's good. But when the individual thinks that he is only by being representative, everything is all right, that's no good, because because what you want to get, it is to the majority of the individuals. And so I broke with the trade union. I still act politically in their instances, because I believe in participation. But it's more of I am looking. It's just I believe in what you say, but I believe in the limitations. There is limitations to it, and in the end, we need organization. We cannot fight state as sometimes you have to defend state, and I don't know, it's this internet thing. Sandler, the internet guy, he himself said, okay, I had an idea that spreading information around the world it would make a change. Now I am older, and I say that it's not only spontaneous information going around that we need. We need also to organize.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, should I respond to some of this thing? Maybe start with Juliana, because this is the big elephant in the room. All right, multi-stakeholder approach sounds all fabulous, I know, very intriguing. For those who are active anyway, you know, you can't wait to be part of it. You raise the hand, particularly the ones sitting in the room, your political science students or activists or academics, you know, you go for it. But you're not, or we are not the majority. I'm fully aware of that. And it's interesting because I just, was it 2 weeks ago, I saw an evaluation or a documentary about what they called civic forums in Germany, and a lot of smaller cities, not villages, cities. They start basically with a multi-stakeholder approach, even in a so-called consolidated democracy with all wonderful institution, but it was a little bit, how can we improve our governance on the local level? So about 10, 15 years ago, also the German government, they supported a lot of these initiatives. They didn't call them multi-stakeholder approach. They called them civic forums, you know, for citizens. Anyway, so there was this one mid-sized town somewhere in southern Germany, and it's not a poor area. It's, you know, it's well, everything. Anyway, so they started with a multi-stakeholder there for local issues. Yeah, global norms, of course, but local issues, you have to solve the problems on the local level. Well, first, to make a long story short, there's two things I want to say, and that hopefully is a response to you. First, how they organized the multi-stakeholder approach, because they had exactly that problem, that if we make an open call to say in 2 weeks there is the session on water pipes or on, I don't know, pedestrians or some sort of things, that whoever wants to come can come. And they had the problem at the beginning that only the activists came anyway, and they came in pairs, you know, like 80% of the people, if they say we have space for 30 people or 40 people, 39 were activists. So, and they didn't want that. They wanted, of course, a good average of the stakeholders, whether it's local companies, maybe business people who have on the street that was concerned, their business, people maybe who do not even go to work, people who are unemployed. You know, they wanted to have the full spectrum of the citizens, and how to get them there, because these people are not even going for elections. They're out of politics, they're out of institutions, they say no democracy. How can you drag them into a multi-stakeholder approach, because it's voluntarily? There's no way you can send the police. That was the first thing. The second, and I tell you how they do it, and I keep the tension up, they have a solution for that. And the second thing is they were asked after 10, 15 years of, you know, of practice, they do this at least every 2 months, they have these forums or the multi-stakeholder thing on something. They were asking the people in this city, they're making a survey, where they are more happy now. And the answer was no. Oh, it sounds very bad. But there was another question. Whether they think that things are more efficient, well, let's say it's not happy, or that they feel things have improved dramatically, that was no. But they felt that now they are better informed and they're more satisfied in a way, because people, now they know, okay, there is this road, and I've been complaining for 150 years that this road, it doesn't have a traffic light for whatever reason, and wouldn't it be better to have a traffic light there? Anyway, and now they are included in every traffic light, or in the decision-making process of every traffic light that is put into the city, and it's explained to them why this is an inefficient way, or they're part of the decision-making why this is an inefficient way. That means the number of complaints have gone down of people, the number sort of kind of aggression, but it's not like the city is more prosperous or it's more, anyway, so social peace has increased, let me put it this way, in the city. And that also turns out into the election. But how to drag the people to the multi-stakeholder approach? What they invented is a formula, very complicated, I couldn't figure it out, of lottery kind of. They say, we know it's a little bit like the opinion polls before election. They work on the same system. Because as you know, if you get the telephone call, I'm sure they make it here in Brazil like in Germany. Before the major election, they take a random number of telephone numbers, they call you and they ask you first, what is your profession? Of course, the white collar people, they wait for the telephone call and you talk to them for half an hour and you tell all your political opinions. But they want the blue collar workers. They want the unemployed to know what they would vote or not vote for. And these people usually don't respond to these calls. They do not participate in surveys. So whenever you get one blue-collar worker, you multiply this blue-collar worker by 100, let's say, whereas as the white people like us, they don't multiply them at all, because this is the proportion of responsiveness of citizens. And they did the same for this multi-stakeholder approach. They say, look, we have a lottery, but when we send out invitations or calls, we have quota. Because we get 500 applications by the activists for 2 seats, and we get 2 applications for 2 blue-collar worker seats, in a way. And they all get in, and the others don't. And they say, we figured with the time, they worked on this formula, who can participate in the multi-stakeholder approach over the years. And they were telling also the stories how they had to improve it, how they failed, because they had to find the formula that works for that particular context. And by the way, when I talk about the Internet Governance Forum yesterday, which apply the multi-stakeholder approach, when you go on their website, they have have a similar system of selecting the stakeholders. They know what kind of stakeholders should be involved, roughly, business, semi-governmental, civic, blah, blah, blah. That's easy. That's the academic way. And then the reality is, how do you get these people? And civil society usually says we are underrepresented. We are 2,000 NGOs or CSOs that work on internet governance. Why are there only 2? And why are these 2 sitting in there and not me? And these are all the very practical problems. They are working on it. The lottery idea, I still think it's an interesting one, and I'm wondering how you can manipulate it. That's the next question. Just, yes, the answer is yes, and this is one way of solving it. There was this, oh yeah, you had many, many good points. What's the underlying cause of enforcement? Here again, the multi-stakeholder approach has following answer, and they never work with terms like enforcement and power. Just bring it to mind. I have to think a little bit more about it. Multi-stakeholder approach and enforcement. Let's say the ideal idea, the idealist idea is, once you have this wonderful formula and you have the perfect setup for whatever issue on a multi-stakeholder roundtable. The idea is everybody participates, gives his or her point of view, and then there is a consensus building. And there comes in the shared responsibility idea. Said, okay, if it's cybersecurity, data protection, which I know a little bit more about, is that the Yahoos, the Googles, and the representatives of Facebook, just to name a few, there are probably more there. When they leave the room, they have a shared responsibility. You agreed on the shared responsibility. You agreed if you do the implementation, they talk about implementation, which is / enforcement. You implement you have made an agreement and you implement your own agreement. And now there is no, in a way, a police that stands behind you and looks whether you do it. But if you violate the agreement in your shared responsibility, you have a responsibility, let's say 20% of implementing the common decision on data protection. The government decided to has 50%, Google has decided to has 20, Facebook 40, whatever, it's 14 or whatever. When you leave the room, you take that with a piece of paper, down, I have 14% responsibility. If I fail to do this, if there are claims, and here is the issue of courts, etc., then I can be held accountable, and we're back in the good governance system. There it comes together. It's not like someone is pushing me. That's a very, again, what I'm saying now, if I would have said this 200 years, nobody would have understood a word of what I'm saying, because enforcement was, you even laws you enforce with people, with soldiers, with military, with Guardia Civil, yeah. And now you implement it yourself. If you fail to do it, you can be held accountable and you have to pay a due, or you even have to go to prison. And the International Criminal Court, which is a very limited sort of, a limited mandate, but this is the first international court we have, or global court, that has its own prison. I mean, this is a novelty. We don't have any other example on this entire planet so far. We don't really know how it will work, but these are first steps which actually go into this self-imposed accountability. I don't know if this is clear, but it's more, you know, if you fail, you get punished. It's not about the other way of enforcement. Sovereignty, legitimacy. Probably have to work a little bit more on the term. You brought it up. And I'm still inspired by this new book by the Club of Rome, because they talk about sovereignty all the time, this relative sovereignty, etc. So they say, look, this whole state sovereignty, that's yesterday, because it basically failed. You know, the idea was, okay, you are legitimate government through elections, whatever political system you have. In some way you are legitimate, that you are president or your government, whatever. This legitimacy gives you some sort, you would say, I mean, in your terms, maybe power or responsibilities to take decisions. As you know, that's why we have parliaments, because we are too busy with our own lives every day to take major decisions. We delegate delegates to the parliament, and these are legitimate. We legitimize them by giving them our trust, our vote, etc. And they have to respond to us in an ideal world, which often they don't. So, and they create this sovereign government and this idea of a sovereign state. Sovereign state basically means they can take the decision for their constituency, you know. And this is why I said yesterday in these other presentations in the evening, it's often underestimated in the case of Germany and the Cold War, that both Germanys is only a sovereign state since 1990. Yeah, people always think that Germany was a sovereign state after World War II. It was not. It was a semi-sovereign state, and this is because there were certain decisions on the military, for instance. Germany was not allowed to have military forces until the 1950s, and they had to ask the American Allied Command whether they can have a military force. And that's a clear indication, as you know, is sovereignty of a state in a nutshell. In the school books or in the textbooks of my students, says this is if you have two powers, and that is monetary power and military power. That makes, in a nutshell, a sovereign state. And monetary power Germany had, but military power it did not have. And this is a good example just to explain again what's a sovereign state. And this, of course, reflects the UN system that you were mentioning, and that is built on this idea of sovereignty. I'm just challenging this idea, and I thought it was very interesting, this recent book by the Club of Rome, where they also say, well, you know, also because of R2P, because of humanitarian intervention, because of non-state actors and who's the armed conflicts, we don't have international wars anymore. The whole thing about monetary units, and I could go on now. They just say it doesn't work anymore. You know, please, we should not be so religious in putting our world on 1945, because that is Security Council, and I go on, yeah? The whole misery there. I'm not saying it wasn't good at that time, but it does not work for the reality anymore. We were just a little bit different. So again, in a way, confirming your doubts, and I'm actually glad you raised it, because it shows that also students are questioning sometimes what you read in the textbooks. The national, the populist thing, I think it's absolutely fascinating. And again, I can only talk a little bit in the European context. And I'm not, because I question the nation state, I'm not easy with saying, oh, they're all a bunch of idiots, this populists and nationalists. Personally, I don't like them, but I think it's very interesting, and sometimes I went to some of the public conventions that they had when they had the manifestations in Germany, because we have this very interesting populist crowd. They are the largest opposition party now in the parliament, and I take them serious. And it's interesting when they make their slogans on the internet, but also in public. In Germany, they used a slogan that was very famous in the 1980s to bring down the Berlin Wall. It says, "Wir sind das Volk," we are the peoples. And today, in a lot of the civic rights movement of East Germany, of the communist Germany, who sacrificed their lives and went on the streets to use that slogan to protest against dictatorship, they feel betrayed now by this new populist movement, because the populist movement in Germany, they abused the slogan of the 1980s for a different cause. all right, I can understand the civic rights movement of the 80s, that they feel hurt, but it's interesting that the populist and even the nationalist movement / nationalist movement in Germany, we have various groups, they all use the same slogan. And actually from a human rights perspective, that's very important, because basically what they say, look, you state institutions, you say you are acting in our name, because, you know, state sovereignty in the name of the peoples, it's like American Hollywood movies, in the name of the, so it's they behind it. And they say, no, you're not acting in my name. No, I'm unhappy for whatever reason. I may disagree with 90% of their reasons, yeah, but that's not what for a social science researcher is so important. It's important when they go on the street that what kind of slogans they use. They want justice. They feel like this is completely unfair, and they say, we are the people. So I would actually invite them to a multi-stakeholder approach, but I'm sure they wouldn't come. So and I think they will stay with that. And again, I think what is interesting in France with Macron, what he basically has done, he has taken the populist and nationalist movement and kind of captured them, kind of hijacked them, and converted them into, in a movement. Because if he would have set up a new party, he would have not gained these votes. And this is very, very interesting to look at. And I think it will be the future, to be honest. I think political parties are the end. And I tell you, it hurts me because I am an institutionalist. I was born with a chip, and I'm a member of a political party in Germany, and I'm an active member. So basically what I'm talking here is the erosion of my own political party. But I'm in the transition process, and I help the party to make a smooth transition. Because I love the party and I love the... Yeah. Where are we getting to? I leave it there. You had a few more points, but I like the sovereignty, the populist, and the enforcement part. Sorry, and I know I'm always talking so long.
Well, thank you. Do you want to make?
Maybe one comment about the hospital case, because I thought it was a very interesting one. Because actually you raised exactly the problem, and you're not alone. I tell you, I hear this often, particularly also from within some of these movements. It's not enough to say, look, but we are a model system and we are great. Maybe they gained the legitimacy, 20, 30 years ago, because they were innovative. Maybe they were special. Yes, they were a legitimate model that people, but you cannot go, not only in this case, in many other cases, we have the same in Germany, 20, 30, 40 years later go and say, well, in the 1960s, we were the most innovative institution in the world, we were the best, we got the Nobel Prize. You still have to trust us now for that. No, my question is always, are you solving the people's problems? Are you serving? And if not, sorry, I don't care whether you have the Nobel Prize. I just don't care. Yeah. So but to know what are the people's problems, I need the multi-stakeholder. I need to know what their issues are. And who am I to tell them? And this is exactly what you're saying, and why you left the unionists. Who am I to tell them what is good for them if I don't even know whether that still fits the times? So I thought it was a very good example. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Anja. Thank you, everybody, to be here today and to participate. I think we had many new questions to go on research, on thinking, and very good provocative presentation, particularly on the question about state legitimacy and where are we going. Thank you. Yeah, we are continuing for some years already on this discussion, different perspectives and prospects on the quality of democracy, either at IPSA context and here, and I'm very glad that we can go on this. Britta has been very productive also in this sharing and proposing questions in this relation. Thank you. Thank you very much.